place, and because the school depended really on public taxation. In 1775, the Franciscans tried to found a university based on the model of the University of Coimbra, with statutes formulated by the Marquis of Pombal. Greek and Hebrew were included in the syllabus alongside rhetoric, philosophy, history, and theology. This project, however, was also doomed to fail. The situation only changed with the arrival of the Portuguese royal family in Brazil in 1880. Another era of educational activity in place before the arrival of King John VI also deserves to be mentioned: the academies, which appeared at the beginning of the 18th century. These academies were founded by a group of scholars and erudite individuals who had paid attention to Brazil's situation, and they reinforced nativism and contributed to the awakening of nationalist sentiment. This was also an echo of the libertarian ideas of French Revolution. I'd like to highlight the Brazilian Academy of the Forgotten of Bahia, which operated for 18 meetings. In these literary academies, Latin was the official language alongside Portuguese. At the end of the century, Arcadia, reference to Greek Arcad, was founded by a group of poets, almost all of whom were Brazilians with a Portuguese education, inspired by Greek poets, Latin poets, and also Italian poets. The imitative poetry produced by this academy was justified through an interpretation of the concept of mimesis from Aristotle's Poetics. Among the poets with knowledge of Greek and Latin, some play an important role in the movement known as Inconfidência Mineira, which sought Brazilian independence from the Portuguese crown. One of these poets was José Bonifácio, the father of independence, whose translation of Anacreonte, Hesiod, Meleagro, and Pindaro were published in 1825. However, this political and literary figure already belonged to the 19th century, during which three important political events took place: the arrival of King John VI in Brazil in 1808, the proclamation of independence, and the proclamation of the Republic. Some scholars argue that the arrival of the Portuguese royal family in Brazil, escaping Napoleon's pressure towards Portugal, represents the true discovery of Brazil, in part due to the opening of Brazilian ports to friendly nations, allowing for reciprocal relations between Brazil and a number of other countries. From 1808 onwards, after the founding of the imperial press, from which the current official Brazilian press emerged, some important political and cultural change took place. A school was founded in which Portuguese and French rhetoric, arithmetic, design, and painting were taught. The National Library was founded in 1810, with 6,000 books donated by the emperor from an archive he brought from the Royal Ajuda Library. In 1840, it was transformed into a public library. The first higher education course also began to appear, and consequently numerous publications, periodicals, and newspapers emerged. Among these publications, it's important to mention in 1840 the first edition of Aristotle's Categories, translated from Greek by Silvestre Ferreira, a minister of state and teacher at the Royal College. The choice of this text was not only philosophical. Ferreira defended the idea that the founding of a nation should base itself on the art of thinking and speaking well. It is also through this project of the founding of a nation that you can understand how José Bonifácio, the translator of Greek poetry I mentioned beforehand, was one of the politicians involved in the project of Brazil's independence. It's curious because the date of the publication of the translation of Aristotle's category was the same year in which the restoration of the Jesuits occurred in Rome. Well, the royal family returned to Portugal in 1821, and Brazil's independence was declared shortly afterwards, in 1822, although this declaration was made by King Pedro I, the son of King John VI. That's to say, the connection with the Portuguese court were maintained. During the imperial period, the Royal Reading Room and the Brazil Historical and Geographical Institute were founded in 1837, and that new higher education courses were created, as well as literary magazines. After the Brazilian Declaration of Independence in 1889, the first Brazilian constitution, inspired by the French Constitution, was introduced. Article 179 of this constitution declared that primary education is free for all citizens. However, the lack of teachers prevented the new education system from functioning properly. A religious presence in the education system continued, but not on a scale comparable to that of former Jesuit institutions. And in 1880, in a report to the Chamber of Deputies, the minister Paulino de Souza lamented the disregard for the education system in Brazil. In 1882, one of the most important politicians and intellectuals in Brazilian history, Rui Barbosa, proposed freedom of teaching, secular teaching, and obligatory schooling, obeying nevertheless the norm of international Masonry. This suggestion was made because despite there having been cultural advance and increasing literacy, the strongest teaching still took place in religious seminars. Of the seminars, there were those that followed the norms of oratory congregation in the spirit of the Marquis de Pombal reforms, such as the Olinda Seminar, founded in 1808, with study of Greek, French, history, physics, and natural history, and those such as Caraça Seminar, founded in 1820, following the model of the Jesuits. This last seminar became one of the most important secondary educational institutions in the country, and here the Ratio Studiorum continued to be followed. This seminar was called the Eton College of Brazil, and a lot of very important political heads studied there. In 1837, in Rio de Janeiro, the São Joaquim Seminar was reformulated, becoming the Pedro II Imperial College. The second emperor of Brazil, King Pedro II, was a learned man and aficionado of classical culture. He visited the excavation of Troy and Mycenae, as well as the French School of Athens, and he participated in the publication of translation of works of Greek literature. Part of the activities relating to classical culture during this period, as well as the maintenance of a collection of books in this area and rhetoric, were due to his personal interest. In the Pedro II College, after completing a 7-year course, the student would receive a Bachelor in Letters. The college, which still exists today, was a fundamental reference in the teaching of humanities, along with some of the seminars, in curriculum including a number of subjects, including ancient and modern language, but Greek studied for 4 years and Latin studied for 7 years received preference. At the time, however, Brazil still had no university, and Brazilian elites continued to travel to Portugal to study in Coimbra. To be a doctor at this time meant, in practical terms, to have been in Coimbra. With the proclamation of the Republic in 1899, there was a general reform of the education system in Brazil. There were innumerable educational projects and proposals that were both diverse and inconsistent. at a certain point in time, positivist philosophy became a strong influence on school organization, substituting the predominance of literature with a predominance of science. It is important to note that the percentage of the Brazilian population considered illiterate in 19 was 75%. The 20s were crucial for political and cultural change, in particular for the vision of the role of the rhetoric and the subjects related to it in Brazilian culture. It's important to highlight the context of a damnatio of rhetoric, exactly at the moment in which the Brazilian university system comes into being. The Federal University of Rio de Janeiro was founded in 1920, and later, by a decree of federal government in 1937, came to be called the University of Brazil. You have in the handout this date, and it's very important to see in the time when the first university were created in Brazil, the rhetoric was expanded. Let's see how. The Federal University of Rio de Janeiro also was founded in 20, and later by decree of federal government in 1937 came to be called the University of Brazil. In 1928, the University of Minas Gerais was founded, and in 1934, the University of São Paulo. Between these 3 days in 1930, the Ministry of Education and Public Health was created, and in 1931, the government approved decrees organizing secondary education and the university system. In this way, the University of São Paulo was the first university to be created and organized according to the norms of the Statute of Brazilian universities. It was in this decade, between various political movements, the founding of the Communist Party, the Lieutenants' Revolt, the Press Column, that the Modern Art Week took place, and that the literary and classical emphasis in education came to an end. Among the various intellectuals and artists who took part in the Modern Art Week and who promote Brazilian modernist art, it is worth mentioning Oswaldo de Andrade and his incisive critique of Brazilian cultural tradition by way of a critique of the rhetorical traditions. In two of Andrade's most important works, we come across attacks on Padre Antônio Vieira and Rui Barbosa, both celebrated representatives of politics and matters in Brazil, and both of whom I mentioned earlier. Both were internationally renowned orators who had made an impression in Europe with their speeches. For Andrade, however, they were symbols of a culture, pedagogy, and rhetorical practice that need to be destroyed. Here are excerpts from two of Andrade's works in which these figures are quoted. You can see in the handout, the first quotation is in the Manifesto Pau Brasil, Brasilwood, Manifesto Brasilwood. And Oswaldo de Andrade said, "Carnival in Rio is a religious happening of the race. World history of São Paulo is the commercial history of Brazil." I'm translating here São Paulo for the word bandeirantes, which means the men who carry flags. Flag means bandeira in Portuguese. And these men, the bandeirantes, they used to go inside Brazil to try to find gold and like in search